Coming Out Stories is a short-run podcast exclusive to the Lesbian Talk Show. The goal of this podcast is to share real stories from real people in the LGBTQIA community. Because this is such a personal journey, I ask that if you do comment on these shows, then please do so positively. The more we stand together and embrace our diversity, the stronger we get as a community. Welcome to Coming Out Stories. I'm Sheena and I'm joined today by Rachel. Rachel writes under a couple of pen names and she will explain that to you in a second. Rachel, thank you for joining me today. First of all, your pen names, what are they?
So I started first writing young adult, kind of like urban fantasy science fiction. And when I started that, I started under R.A. Marshal. R for Rachel, the rest of it is family, different family names. But then when I started writing lesbian fiction, I went with Eliza Andrews. And that was actually my mom's suggestion, which is kind of funny. So Eliza Andrews is an ancestor of mine who was she was actually a novelist and an essayist and a world famous botanist around the time of the Civil War in the U.S. She kind of has a funny story. So she wrote a couple of, like, if you're a Civil War historian in the United States, you might have heard of her. Otherwise, you haven't. But she wrote a couple of important books that they still use in Civil War scholarship. The most important, she published her journals about living through the Civil War in Georgia, which is where my family is from. In other words, the Deep South for non-Americans. But she was a funny lady. She decided not to marry because she was disappointed with the quality of men who wanted to marry her because she was from a very well-to-do plantation family. My family was like very Southern, blue blood, very wealthy, like plantation owners. But after the Civil War, they were economically devastated. And so the only people who wanted to marry her were like ex-army guys, and that was like below her station. And so she decided she would just support herself, which was very unusual for, mid-19th century woman. But she ended up becoming a professor at a college in Georgia and supported herself the rest of her life. But anyway, so I picked her, like I said, it was my mom's suggestion, but in a way it's sort of tongue-in-cheek because she represents a part of my family history that I think I would rather forget and rather move on from, as a sort of racist, slave-owning past. So kind of appropriating her name was sort of an intentional jab at my own family history. So that's the story on my pen names.
All right. Today you're here to tell us your coming out story.
Okay. Let's see. How do I usually tell it? So I was a little bit of a late bloomer, which is sort of funny because I'm one of these kind of on the butch side of the spectrum of lesbian where everybody knew I was gay long before I did. People were waiting for me to come out long before that was really in my awareness, in my consciousness. But eventually, let's see, it kind of started with, I realized after high school, I realized that my two best girlfriends had been dating for like a year and a half and I'd never realized it. And it made a lot of our friendship dynamics suddenly make more sense because, of course, again, they both knew I was gay. I didn't know I was gay, so some of the weirdness, it was kind of a love triangle that I didn't realize I was a part of. So, if that makes any sense. I think that one of my close friends felt like I was the only potential competition for the affection of my other close friend. And it really changed our friendship when they started dating. But I didn't understand why our friendship had suddenly changed until after they broke up and they both came to me all heartbroken because I was the shoulder to cry on for both of them. And then I was like, okay. And I guess that was when I started to really look at myself kind of through the lens of their relationship and started to understand just my own sexuality through that process. So it took me until I was a senior in college. So I was about 21. So I came out to myself around 18, I guess, 18, 19. But then it took until I was a senior before I finally worked up the nerve to ask out a girl, you know. And then the girl I ended up dating, her name was Carol. She'd been dating girls since high school. It was all old hat for her. And she was a little shocked when she realized I wasn't really publicly out. I mean, to be fair, it was the late 90s, early 2000s. So it was a little bit of a different world. And it was also the Deep South that we're talking about again. So it's not the friendliest place in the US to be a queer person. But she was really the one who kind of dragged me out of the closet, because she was kind of like, well, I just don't know that I can date someone who's not out. And so little by little, I started to work my way out. But like I said, I was a senior in college. So for some reason, I can't even tell you why, but for some reason I had in my mind that I wanted to move to Seattle after I graduated, which is like basically as far away from where I lived as you can get in the United States. So I lived in the southeastern corner, and Seattle, Washington is in the northwestern corner of the US. And my parents were totally befuddled by this, and they just couldn't figure out, why would I want to go to Seattle? And so when I finally came out to my parents on the phone, you know, I told them, well, you know, I've been seeing someone. And my mom was like, well, what's his name? And I was like, well, that's the thing, Mom. What's her name? Her name is Carol. And my dad, before I got that far, when my mom was like, well, what's his name? My dad goes, is he from Seattle? Like, he'd finally found it. Like, he'd finally found the answer to all his questions, like why I wanted to move to Seattle. Is he from Seattle? And I was like, well, that's the thing, guys. It's actually her. It's her name. And my mom was kind of stunned silence, you know, like, okay. But my dad took it all in stride, and he goes, is she from Seattle? And that was it. That was my parents' reaction. Like, he wasn't really interested in the fact that I was gay. He was interested in, like, why did I want to go to Seattle? So anyway, I was like, no, actually, she's from South Carolina. She's actually in Reverie, in the personal essay at the back of the book. That's the person that I wrote about, is my first girlfriend, Carol, who she and I are still pretty good friends to this day, 20 some odd years later. That makes me feel like an old lady. And then, yeah, so that was the main part of my coming out. I came out to my grandparents, who have both passed since, but I remember that phone call was, my grandfather was a little like, well, maybe you just haven't met the right guy. And my grandmother, on the other hand, she goes, oh, Rachel, I've known you were gay since forever. Like, why are you telling me this? Like, I don't care. Like, you know, I think she figured it out when I was about 5. So that's my story. Like I said, it's not the most exciting story, but I'm lucky, you know, I'm really lucky. My parents are both pretty liberal people. They were both super accepting. Like, it took my mom a minute to come to terms with it. It took my dad, you know, a different way to come to terms with it, but it wasn't a very painful process the way it could have been, the way it is for many people. So I count myself as super fortunate in that regard. And my parents, in fact, these days, they are some of my best beta readers. And I'm a little like, I don't know, like when I started writing lesbian fiction, I'm like, are you sure you want to read this? Because there's a lot of gay sex in here. And they're like, oh, I don't care. Like, sex is sex. And so they were fine with it. And actually Reverie, my dad in particular, Reverie is his favorite book. out of all the books well, probably my fantasy book, they both like a little bit better, but my dad really liked Reverie, so. Yep, that's my story.
You're listening to The Lesbian Talk Show. TheLesbianTalkShow.com, your hub of podcast information.
Can I just ask, how do you identify, like, what are your various labels?
You know, I'm kind of old-fashioned in that way. I'm just gay. You know, I guess, you know, I probably identify as being more butch, definitely on the more butch end of the spectrum. But other than that, you know, I don't. Labels have gotten really complicated the last 10 years. And I don't know. Again, it makes me feel like a little bit of an old fart, but it's too complicated for me to keep up with. So I just stick with the L in LGBTQIA plus. So anyway.
If you had to give advice to somebody who's struggling with coming to terms with their sexual orientation, what would you say to them?
Oh gosh, what a good question. You know, I mean, it's especially a pertinent question since I'm working at a high school now and I'm looking to get involved with what they term the GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance, which is kind of the club on campus for queer kids. So I need to have a good answer for this question. I think what's important to know is that you'll always find your community sooner or later. You know, it might take a while to find that community, to build that community, to build the people who accept you just as you are. I think it's also really important not to feel pressured to adopt anybody's label for you in any direction. You know, I think one thing that's interesting about the queer community is even within our community, we pressure people in different ways to identify in one direction or another. Like, I remember definitely there was a time when I was initially coming out where sometimes I felt like I wasn't butch enough. And that was sort of like, I'd spent my whole life, like, never being feminine enough for the mainstream world. And then within the queer community, sometimes I felt like I wasn't butch enough, you know, and there was pressure to be a certain way or something like that within our community. And these days, I think we see it a lot with like transphobia. I think we see it with bisexual people. That's always been a problem, is like, if you're bisexual, you're not queer enough. And I find that really problematic.
And if you are bisexual, if you're a bisexual woman and you're married to a man, then people negate the fact that you're bisexual, and it's like, well, why? And if you're with a woman, then lesbians want to label you as lesbian, and I'm like, well, but why? Because bisexual is a completely legitimate space to be in, and if that's how you feel, that's who you are.
Exactly. And for me personally, just the type of women that I've always been attracted to, inevitably everyone I've ever dated has been with men, you know, at some point, you know, whether they actively identify as bisexual or they don't, like, they've all been with men at some point, you know. And like my current girlfriend is coming out of a heterosexual marriage of, you know, 12 plus years. And that, you know, she was a Lambda literary fellow. They do a fellowship for emerging queer authors every year. And I'm going to brag on her for just a second, because she did that fellowship. It's a really hard fellowship to get accepted to. And not only did she get into it, she got the full ride scholarship a couple of years ago with people like the author Melinda Lowe. She wrote Ash, and she wrote Huntress, and she was like super complimentary of my girlfriend's writing and was like, oh yeah, the board decided unanimously to give you the scholarship, like, independently of each other. So anyway, but she found, like, even in the Lambda conference, at one point, there was a conversation going on during one of their sessions where a couple of people were really bashing queer people who aren't out. And, she coming out has been something that she's really struggled with because she has been labeled heterosexual her whole life because she is from a very traditional Asian family where it's not okay to be queer. And coming out is hard for her. She kind of stood up for herself in that meeting and then said, it's not easy for all of us to be out and to live out. I think visibility is a really interesting issue, like who gets to be visibly queer and who doesn't, and whether that's an advantage or a disadvantage. I think it really depends on context. But, for her, as she's probably the girliest woman I think I've ever met in my entire life. She's super feminine. For her, she made the point that she has to come out day after day after day after day. Coming out isn't, like, for me, people just look at me and they go, oh, gay lady, like, dyke. People don't look at her and assume that. And so coming out has to be something she does deliberately and awkwardly and over and over and over again. And that's its own kind of baggage and burden.
The gatekeepers, the people who say how queer you have to be or how you have to, represent that queerness and whatever it is, does a lot of damage to people who are coming out later in life, people who they consider not lesbian enough, not butch enough, not whatever enough. If I think back to when I was first coming to terms with it, it took me years and years and years before I came to terms with it within myself. Never mind coming out to the rest of the world. Because there is such a negative connotation. And then when people try to force you out of the closet, you just become more determined to step into the closet and hold on tight because you're not ready to take that step yet. So it's completely damaging, and people in the queer community should know better.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so true. And even for me, I've been out for 20 years, I'm comfortable in my own skin. I get misgendered even now, even living in San Diego, Southern California, which is obviously much more tolerant than the deep South where I'm from. I still get misgendered probably about once a week. Someone mistakes me for a guy in the women's restroom or something like that. And so it's still as liberal as the place where I live, I still have to wrestle with homophobia on a pretty regular basis. And I came out to, this past week, I came out to all of my high school students, all 80 plus of them, I guess. And part of the reason I did that was because there were a handful of kids who were kind of making snide comments, what they thought was behind my back. The funny thing about teenagers is they think they're sneaky, but they're never sneaky. We were all teenagers. We know exactly what they're doing. But anyway, they were making snide homophobic comments behind my back. And so I was just like, well, let's just address this head on. And, so I came out to all of them and talked about that it's hard growing up, dealing with homophobia all the time. And I was surprised, even as an adult who's been out for 20 plus years, it was hard. I was, I was really nervous in some of my classes. By the time I got to the last class, and I'd done it 4 times, it was more comfortable and I was able to get through it smoothly. But it was tough to come out to all of them and tell them, listen, when you make gay jokes, which I have heard already in your classroom, that is a knife in my heart. And I promise you, it's a knife in the heart of other kids that whether you know that they're out or not, So anyway.
But it is hard because the constant coming out means that you never feel 100% safe because there's that kind of clench in your stomach every time you have to out yourself to someone. What is the reaction going to be? And this is, 20 years later or whatever it is, after coming to terms with it within yourself, every single time you have to come out. Every time you have to say, I'm married to a woman and not a man.
It's true, isn't it? I think homophobia is a really interesting thing because there's so many layers to it. I think we say homophobia and we just automatically, we go to the most extreme cases, of, violence against queer people, for example. But there's so many different layers of homophobia. Like when you just said, saying like, I'm married to a woman and not a man. And the way like, some people are like, oh, okay, cool. And then other people, they start to unintentionally exclude you from conversations, which is a layer of homophobia. They start to have conversation. Like this happens to me a lot where, like if I'm in a group of straight women and they're talking about, and they're not trying to exclude me from the conversation, but that's the net effect, is that it's a conversation I can't really participate in. Like they go on and on about their boyfriends and how stupid men are, which anyway, that's another conversation, but and like every now and like I've been in conversations before where every now and then I'll like throw out like, oh yeah, like this happens to me in my relationship. And everybody just kind of goes, huh. Okay. Yeah. And then they just go back to their other conversation that you can't really and that's like a subtle form of homophobia because you're always on the outside looking in different ways,
Or they ask you about how you have sex because it's our job to educate everybody as to, how the female anatomy works. It's like, well, sweetie, if you don't know how your own body works, I can't help you out on this.
Yeah. I should knock on wood, but I've never had to go through that. No one's ever asked me that
Everyone
question.
asks me. I guess I'm just one of those people where people feel like I'm okay to ask this question to because everybody asks me this.
Well, I tell you what drives me up the wall, and I haven't had this in a while, but what I can't stand is when straight men talk to me about women the way they talk to each other about women. And you find yourself in this like locker room conversation, objectifying women and objectifying, female bodies. And it just makes my skin crawl. It makes my skin crawl. Like, what? Like, don't you know I am a woman? And you are speaking to me like as if this is an okay way to talk about women, and it's just like, wow. And it gives you a lot of insight into what goes on in straight male culture. And it makes me really happy that I am gay because I would never want to date one of these people. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I get that one more than I get the like, how do lesbians have sex question.
Okay. All right. So if people want to read your work, what do you suggest they start with?
Oh gosh, I mean, I feel like it depends on what people are into because I have kind of, the book that I have written most recently was Princess of Dorsa, and that is kind of a classic fantasy novel that happens to have queer women protagonists, and so I think people who are into fantasy and they're also identify as queer or they just like different types of stories, that might be a book where they could start, is Princess of Dorsa. But I also have a lot of kind of more contemporary pieces, contemporary romance pieces. So, Reverie is sort of kind of a different sort of book. Like you said, there's a lot of spoilers in that book, so I don't want to give too much away. So I placed that in the romance category, but it's so many other things as well. It's a different sort of book. So it's sort of a cross genre book.
It's not a romance. You can't call it a romance because you're just going to have unhappy readers because there's no happy ever after.
Yeah. Well, there kind of is, but it's kind of a belated and sideways happily ever after. Nope. Sheena says no.
Nope. Sheena says no. Just no. But it is an excellent book.
Well, it's not a romance, but I put it in the romance category because it does revolve around a love story at its sort of.
Okay, so love story I can go with.
Okay.
But it's not a romance. But it is a really fascinating book. So it was our September book club read, so you should absolutely pick up a copy of Reverie. It is a book you will never read twice. Like, you will never experience this same story ever again. Because it's just one of those unique, amazing books. Okay, and where can people find you online?
Probably the best place to start is my website. So my website is authorelizaandrews.com. authorelizaandrews.com. Then same thing with Facebook is facebook.com/authorelizaandrews. That's my Facebook page, and I've been a really good girl lately. I've been updating it regularly, like a responsible adult. Instagram's a little different because I'm not under Eliza Andrews. I'm under my other pen name. So my Instagram is instagram.com/ramarshal.writer.
And that's all for Coming Out Stories. So thank you very much for telling us your story and getting into some philosophical conversations there.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it, Sheena.
We thank our guest for sharing a very personal part of their lives with us and hope that you connected with their journey. You can find our guests online. Check the show notes for links. The Lesbian Talk Show is all about sharing love and connecting with one another, and we hope that these stories help you do that. Because this is such a personal journey, I ask that if you do comment on these shows, then please do so positively. The more we stand together and embrace our diversity, the stronger we get as a community. Please know that you are under no obligation to come out. It is a very personal journey, and only you can know when you are ready and whether or not it is safe to come out. If you enjoy these podcasts, consider becoming a patron of the talk show. The link is in the show notes. I'm Sheena, and this has been Coming Out Stories.